Let me, before we begin, acknowledge our university and community supporters. Thanks very much to the University of Iowa's international programs and its honors program, as well as to the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization for their financial help. Thanks also to today's special financial sponsors, John Menninger and Paul Weller and Sarah Rhines. So now let me turn to introducing Ted Powers. As I mentioned, he's an assistant professor with a joint appointment in anthropology and global health. He is a sociocultural anthropologist whose research focuses on the dynamics of health, politics, and social inequality, primarily in post-apartheid South Africa. He received his BA in political science in 2001 from Bates College in Maine, and he subsequently received a master's degree in 2007 and a Ph.D. in anthropology in 2012 from the City University of New York. He's published his research in a variety of outlets, including the Journal of African History, the AIDS Legal Quarterly, the Journal of Southern African Studies, and the Journal of Modern African Studies. Before coming to Iowa, Ted taught at Hunter College, Columbia University, Pace College, and the University of Pretoria. So please join me in welcoming Ted Powers as he speaks to us on public health in post-apartheid South Africa.
Good afternoon. Thanks to Ed for the introduction and Bill for the introduction as well. So today I'm going to be reflecting on some of my more recent fieldwork in South Africa. I was fortunate enough to return to the field, my field sites last summer supported by an Old Gold grant from the University of Iowa. So I'm going to open actually with an ethnographic vignette or description of some of the research that I do in the South African townships. Before I turn to some of the research questions that I'm thinking through at the moment, and in order to frame the questions that I'm asking and some of the kind of dynamics that I'll be outlining, I'm going to talk a bit about the dynamics of health and society across South African history, how the Campaign for AIDS Treatment Access fits in with that, and some of the ongoing challenges that are facing us today relative to the epidemic in South Africa. It was a cool morning, the sun out, but not yet strong enough to chase away the cold of the Cape winter night. I'd come home early in the day to visit a friend, Bongani, in his home in Khayelitsha, a township located approximately 20 miles from central Cape Town. I have known Bongani for well over a decade, as we first met through my research on the politics of AIDS in South Africa. During the time we have known one another, we have grown and changed, started families, and progressed with our work in different ways. Bongani, who had previously worked for South Africa's leading HIV/AIDS organization, the Treatment Action Campaign, now worked for a well-known global health organization. He had continued to progress with his work, counteracting the effects of the AIDS epidemic in his community, and in doing so, had also begun to accumulate some of the markers of middle-class status in South Africa. A few years ago, when I had previously visited Bongani, he had purchased an older car that he and his father were slowly fixing, making repairs in piecemeal fashion as resources allowed. Times had changed now, and in Bongani's yard sat a Volkswagen Polo, a relatively new car that attested to his newfound socioeconomic status. Things were indeed progressing for Bongani, although he did know that there was only so far that he could move forward. The organization that he worked for tended to employ in-country staff for particular positions, and given that he had risen through the ranks already, there was no further from Bongani to climb the NGO ladder, or non-governmental organization. This had left him feeling frustrated, but nevertheless, he appreciated his newfound position of economic security. Indeed, Bongani's progression to the middle class stood in stark contrast to others who lived in his area. As I stood in Bongani's yard facing the street, a man in a blue bucket-style hat stumbled around the corner, bumping into the cracked wooden post as he wandered into the enclosure. He wove as he walked, his eyes glazed and his expression blank, seemingly familiar with his settings as he had alerted no one to his presence. I sat on the threshold to Bongani's shack, squatted in the doorway, and as the men walked closer, I watched him walk, and, seeing a familiar pair of red pants, recognized an old friend. "Sipiwe," I said. "It's me, Ted." As I stood up, he stepped back, squinting, his eyes red and bloodshot. He refocused, and cracking a broad smile, he walked towards me. We embraced, and he stepped back, looking at me again. "Tjo, it's been a long time," Sipiwe said, and stood in front of me. As Sipiwe stood there, it gave me a moment to take in why I had not been able to recognize him at first sight. His cheekbones were more pronounced than I had remembered, cutting across his face with a severity that left me concerned. He turned, teetering, murmuring as he continued his search for Bongani around the corner of the shack. As he turned, I could see the full extent of Sipiwe's weight loss. The red pants that had caught my attention were now well worn, with parts of the leg torn, showing Sipiwe's skin despite the cold winter weather. The pants, which had once hugged his form tightly, now hung off Sipiwe's waist. His legs, once strong and thick, now swam in his pant legs, unsteady as they were skinny. Sipiwe returned from around the corner of the shack, stepping awkwardly towards his entrance just as Bongani emerged from his sister's shack, which was just behind his own. Walking behind Sipiwe, he called out his friend's name, but Bongani walked past his diminished comrade stridently, not directly looking at him as he did so. I had asked Bongani from time to time about Sipiwe, as we had all been mutual friends from my time carrying out research on the politics of the South African AIDS epidemic. When I'd asked after Sipiwe, Bongani had always offered a cryptic response, telling me that our friend was here and there, but he's also everywhere. So many places that I can't keep track. Now as Sipiwe stood in front of us, I fully understood what he had meant. Sipiwe did not have a home. He was now transient, and apparently at some point along the way, he had succumbed to alcoholism. I should have listened and understood what Bongani was trying to tell me, in his own polite way. That Sipiwe had given up on improving his community, on fighting the AIDS epidemic, on counteracting the injustices that he encountered in everyday life, as he had when I had known him years ago. But it is one thing to read statistics about alcoholism, and it is another thing to see someone that is close to you fall prey to one of the most common vices in the South African townships. My chance encounter with Sipiwe has stuck with me and has led me to return to some of my experiences in poor and working class communities in South Africa's black urban areas over the past 12 years. Sorry, this is a little bit heavy. Take a deep breath, maybe. So, seeing Sipiwe that day, which has obviously stuck with me quite a bit, has led me to think about many of the dynamics that I've observed and experienced alongside friends and research participants over the past several years. And one of the phrases that really began to stick out to me and began to resonate with me in a different way was this saying, "I am surviving." You can ask someone how they are. They'll say, "Tjo, I am surviving," or "We're struggling, we are suffering, but we are surviving." And it's this mantra, refrain in the townships. And, you know, I've heard it for years, more than a decade now, and it had not really struck me in the same way until these kind of trajectories of social life had begun to emerge to me as I've conducted research over an extended period of time. But I began to think, is this a statement? What does it represent? Does it represent the broader socioeconomic and material conditions that Black South Africans have faced for centuries? Does it reflect a larger underlying social principle? That the continuation of life is this essential ethos in Black urban social formations? And what does it mean to survive in the face of colonization, of apartheid, of racial segregation, and the violence that was created by these political systems? So in thinking through this particular set of questions, I've come across this concept of survivance. This is a concept that's been used by different academicians in different contexts. Derrida referred to this as a type of existence that hangs somewhere just between life and death. For the Québécois, this refers to a period of time during which the kind of British colonial authorities attempted to kind of limit or undermine Francophone culture. But generally speaking, across its various iterations, it refers to survival, endurance, and resistance, largely in the face of colonization. And Gerald Vizenor is an historian and kind of, I guess, critic, and he offers a critique of various forms of kind of historical encounters between the United States and kind of indigenous populations in native North America. And he's theorized survivance as an active sense of presence, the continuation of native or indigenous stories, and not a mere reaction to colonization. All right, and he talks about survivance stories as historian. And he's talking about renunciations of dominance, tragedy, and victimry. Now, I'm trying to think through this kind of mantra of I am surviving, through this concept of survivance in my work. And I'm not just thinking about stories, given that the colonial encounter has actually been different in South Africa. Its historical depth is less. And many of the kind of traditional social, political, and cultural practices did not have the same degree or same variant of interruption as what was encountered in native North America. So one of the ways that I'm trying to think this concept through in my fieldwork are the ways in which social life has been organized in townships and in rural areas in South Africa to ensure survival amidst difficult and pressing material concerns. And the reason why this is important for my work and why I've come across this is that those who are surviving, those who are making efforts to survive, are precisely the same populations that are infected with HIV/AIDS, that historically haven't been infected with tuberculosis. So there's this overlap between historical inequality, mechanisms that are created socially to survive in the AIDS epidemic. So when we're thinking about what the AIDS movement is and what it has done, I'm increasingly begin to see it as part of a broader historical arc that has carried forward principles of social organization and ways of approaching social life to maintain social life as a goal and to maintain human life as a goal, which is broadly the aims of the AIDS movement, fits into a broader set of historical social principles that have been maintained in the face of white minority rule in Southern Africa. So there are many ways to talk about health and society in South Africa, but I think one of the more illustrative ways to start is to give you an idea about land. Now this image, small as it is, offers a picture of the modern boundaries of South Africa. Now within the modern boundaries of South Africa, and at the time that this map was made, Botswana and Namibia were technically part of South Africa, at least in terms of the way in which they were governed. But you can see, or probably actually you can't see in the back, but there's actually two shaded areas in this map. There's a darker area, which is the areas that were set aside for the black South African population in 1913, and there's a slightly lighter shaded area where the black areas were expanded to by 1936. But one of the reasons why I think this image is actually quite important for understanding the history of health and society in South Africa is it gives you kind of a very tangible idea about the way in which land and resources were divided along racial lines between variants of the South African population. In other words, between people of African descent and white settlers. The vast majority of arable land went to white settlers. And when we think about the black South African population, there's a kind of an imagery that we have, and I've kind of fed into it to some degree, of shacks, of urban slums. And what I want to start to kind of explain and maybe elucidate is that the same question of densification exists in rural areas as well, historically for the black South African population. So when we begin to imagine South Africa as a kind of not densely populated country, semi-arid, large swaths of farmland, but large swaths of semi-arid areas, this does not actually kind of coalesce or at least kind of contour with the ways in which social life has unfolded for almost 2 centuries for people of African descent. So when we begin to think about health and society and the resources that would be utilized or leveraged to maintain health, I think that this is an image that can at least begin to communicate some of the ways in which unequal health outcomes have been produced in the South African population. And I think, generally speaking, for any of you who've kind of heard other lectures, perhaps by Professor Espinosa, there are some general contours to the way in which health systems were developed during colonial periods, in that they were primarily developed for the benefit of the white settler population. That too is the case in South Africa, which, again, in line with many of the dynamics of the time were concentrated in urban areas where often colonial administrations would be based. And when disease outbreaks did occur, they were often utilized to divide the population. In South Africa, that occurred along racial lines. And there are scholars who have referred to this as sanitary syndrome, or the idea that the ways in which the principles of sanitation were put into motion and operationalized in the colonial world were done along the lines of citizens and subjects, or those who had citizenship within the empire and those who were subjected to the authority of the kind of colonial rule. So when we begin to think about the dynamics across history that have carried forward unequal health outcomes between different populations, be it outbreaks of plague, like in Cape Town around 1902, that set the stage for how urban modeling would occur under apartheid, or HIV/AIDS. All right. Broadly, what we've seen historically in South Africa is the concentration of these epidemics within the Black South African population. And these are some of the reasons why. Now, of course, we also need to take into account the role of rural missions when we begin to understand how health and society is operated in South Africa. Many of these missions would have been from either England or Scotland in the South African case, and they actually were some of the only outlets for the Black South African population, particularly in rural areas, to access kind of the amenities of modern health or something approximating that. They also importantly provided education, literacy, and many of these missions educated the first kind of wave of the African National Congress, which I mentioned before that the kind of contours of land enclosures occurred in 1913. That's also the year the African National Congress formed as a political entity to counteract the expropriation of land, resources, and citizenship of the Black South African population. So there's kind of a very close relationship between the kind of enclosure of citizenship rights, which in the Cape Colony had been extended to some educated Africans, and the kind of taking those rights away with the establishment of the Union of South Africa, which essentially was a kind of political compromise between the Afrikaans-speaking white population and the British colonial government after the South African War between 1898 and 1902. So to go back to this question of the rural population, as I mentioned before, the kind of Black South African population had been essentially kind of concentrated into rural enclosures. We have different forms of, these were also native reserves as we have reservations in the United States, with some of the same dynamics that we see here. Some of the ways in which it was different were that there were a series of Hutt taxes, and these were utilized to kind of underwrite the cost of the colonial enterprise and of native administration. One of the effects of the Hutt tax was densification. I guess in English, what that would mean is that many people would live in the same hut. Further, one of the things that we also see is that the traditional areas or customary areas in rural areas where the Black population was concentrated were ruled via traditional rule or traditional authorities. And within these kind of rural areas, there was an unequal allocation of resources amongst the Black South African population themselves, with those from kind of aristocratic lineages, of which Nelson Mandela was one. There would be more land and resources allocated for that group. So there's stratification also within rural areas here as well. So we can't say that health outcomes were necessarily the same for all of the rural Black South African population, but it correlated along lines of lineage, of genealogy, and those who had traditionally ruled these societies. What we see and how this operated, and again, try and keep in mind that map that I showed you, hold on to it, that between these kind of rural enclosures or reserves, many of the men would migrate for work. And this was primarily because the land was insufficient for subsistence agriculture. It was both low in soil quality and insufficient for the population. You have to keep in mind that approximately 80% of the population was pushed onto about 12% of the land. So when we think about how this worked, it was not a system that was designed to have sufficient land for the Black South African population. It was designed to create a need for migrant labor to the mines, to the gold mines, to the diamond mines, and to the farms. Someone had to work the land. That was a lot of land. So as people moved, so did pathogens. And what we see is that from the mines, tuberculosis moves from Eastern Europe down to the South African mines. The conditions, particularly for the African mine workers, were actually quite challenging. Many of them became infected with tuberculosis. And when they went back after their 6 to 10 month contract would end on the mines, they'd go back to rural areas, and they would bring TB with them. And do you remember what I said to you about the Hutt taxes? Intensification? Well, in a small hut with very little airflow, families would become infected. And some of these reserves, up to 75% of the population had TB upon the turn of the 20th century. So when we're thinking about these kind of lines of movement, of labor, all right, of enclosure, people moved and so did pathogens. And the lines of movement, we can trace these lines of movement up until today because the reserves continue to exist today, right? And they're now called customary areas, but traditional authorities still wield authority in these rural reserves of a different ilk. But the same lines we saw a syphilis epidemic in the 1930s. And so what we see here, right, is a challenging situation within South Africa for the Black South African population across history. Now, it's important to mention that this has not gone unchallenged. And in fact, Dr. Sidney Koch actually went into the KwaZulu homelands in the 1930s and developed an initiative called community-oriented primary care that educated the community about things like basic epidemiology, infant measurements, kind of basic nutrition, and they produced startling results within 5 years. These ideas were brought as policy to the Gluckman Commission in 1945. They were a model for national policy in rural areas. Unfortunately, in 1948, the National Party came to power and began to implement apartheid. So these ideas, which generated out of South African society to address rural health, were never implemented. In fact, the apartheid state also closed the rural missions during the 1950s and 60s, so outlets for access to healthcare in rural areas diminished. And as you can imagine, so did health outcomes to a certain degree. So in the 1970s, in the late 1970s, these debates and currents begin to gain steam again. Again, just as the AIDS epidemic is beginning to kind of move across Central Africa and into Southern Africa. And what we see is that a primary care movement begins to generate in South Africa, and this, in fact, becomes the roots of the HIV/AIDS movement. Early primary care health activists who began to see AIDS in communities and begin to address it. So when we look to the post-apartheid era, what we see is that the government has focused on the development of the primary care system. They developed and updated well over 2,500 primary care clinics. Primary care is free to all South Africans if you are able to see someone at the clinic. And it's available at no fee. All right, so these are, I want to emphasize, there have been important developments and shifts in the ways in which the South African government has attempted to address the question of health in the post-apartheid era. And they've attempted to build the roots of a public health system that's kind of owned and operated by the state, much of which has been developed in rural areas. So there have been genuine attempts to address this historical legacy. But as you think you can imagine, the AIDS epidemic has proven to be a very difficult obstacle to overcome, to both develop a primary care system and address the world's largest HIV/AIDS epidemic simultaneously. So this picture was taken in actually 2007. On the right, on your right, is a friend of mine, Vatiswa, and this is in St. George's Cathedral in downtown Cape Town. And this is a picture or an image that you will see in many parts of South Africa around clinics, which is people in HIV-positive T-shirts. Now, wearing the HIV-positive T-shirt does not mean that you yourself definitely have HIV. It is a show of solidarity with others living with HIV in South Africa to say, I could have HIV. You could have HIV. We all could have HIV, right? HIV affects everyone. And so many AIDS activists wear this. I think most in the AIDS movement wear this regardless of their status. And I think it's an important kind of indicator and kind of symbol associated with the contemporary AIDS movement. So just a little bit of background on the AIDS movement before we move on to some questions about the contemporary situation. The situation in South Africa was somewhat unique insofar as a kind of faction of the ruling African National Congress questioned the link between HIV and AIDS and argued that HIV may in fact not cause AIDS. It's important to also note that many of the studies that they cited to make that case came from American scientists. This is not a case of African exceptionalism by any means. Nevertheless, because the faction included the president and the minister of health, there were significant delays in implementing antiretroviral therapy, or ART, which is the kind of scientific best standard for treating HIV/AIDS. It kind of interrupts viral replication. They characterized it as poisonous. And again, many of these debates came out in the 1990s in the US about AZT. It's very conservatively estimated that delaying treatment access in South Africa prematurely ended the lives of over 300,000 people. There are other estimates that are much higher than that. So one of the things that I'm interested in thinking through is how the AIDS movement was able to mobilize such a large foundation of support in South Africa. And one of the ways that they were able to do this is, as I mentioned, kind of many of the kind of earlier AIDS activists were a part of the primary kind of care campaign, primary health campaign. They were a part of the anti-apartheid campaign. So when we think about kind of historical continuities in health in the population, there's also continuities in those who are seeking to address illness and inequality. And we see that in the kind of the anti-apartheid movement during the late apartheid era, and that continues into the post-apartheid era. Now, many of those AIDS activists and primary care activists successfully negotiated for the inclusion of a right to health in the South African Constitution. It's very important because it enabled certain kind of legal approaches to be utilized to support socioeconomic rights. So, famously, there's a case on access to the prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV, PMTCT, where the Treatment Action Campaign, which is an organization that I research with, took a case to the Constitutional Court, a South African version of a Supreme Court, and successfully argued that not providing or not having the capability for PMTCT at all South African clinics violated the right to health for South African children. Now, that essentially forced the government and the AIDS dissident kind of clique to begin moving towards AIDS treatment access in South Africa. But I really want to emphasize that they were able to do so because of the work of health activists during an earlier period of South African history and their ability to kind of develop rights-based AIDS policy, have a constitutional right to health, and other constitutional protections that enable this to occur. But legal principles alone were insufficient for this to be successful. In fact, because the dissident clique controlled the Ministry of Health, controlled the presidency, it required far more than just a legal case, because the government was very, very slow in accrediting clinics for ART, for enabling AIDS drugs to even be purchased by the government. There are many ways in which this process was slowed. It required community mobilization, direct action, civil disobedience, occupying offices of the government, being arrested, and eventually they successfully argued and worked with members of the government to restructure the National AIDS Council, and they became the leading force within it. And they redirected policies that enabled AIDS treatment to become widely available. At the current moment, it's at near universal levels, particularly for women and children. And this is where the kind of state capacity has been best developed. But it was not possible without the AIDS movement and without their kind of actually working within the government to recreate laws, to kind of oversee the Department of Health, to make sure that they bought the drugs, they delivered them to clinics. And I was fortunate enough to be there for when some of this was occurring, and I'm happy to share it with you today. Now, one of the questions that I've been grappling with now is, okay, now we have near universal levels of treatment access. And we have folks like Bongani who are living lives who are kind of upwardly mobile, but then we also have Sipiwe and his life trajectory. Now, how do we make sense of these divergent life trajectories of young Black South African men in the townships? What has changed with AIDS treatment access? And this is a picture of young men looking for work in South Africa, which is, in fact, quite common. Now, South African kind of politics and economy are defined by inequality. It's one of the most unequal societies in the world. Almost half of the population lives on less than $2 a day. 10 million people live on less than $1 a day. The Gini coefficient has increased in the post-apartheid era, which means that South Africa is more unequal now than it was during apartheid. I know that's shocking. That is what the numbers tell us. And the 90% of South Africans living in poverty are black. So this continues to follow the racial lines created by apartheid, colonization, etc. Now, the government has developed initiatives to try and address these issues. They developed a large-scale social grants program, essentially state redistribution to support those who do not make enough money to feed and clothe themselves. This really started in 2003, the same year that AIDS treatment access began to be publicly available. It's more than doubled, more in a decade, the number of people who qualify for social grants for children, pensioners, the disabled, and it's up to 16.4 million, and it's estimated that it'll be nearly 18 million by next year, which is about a third of the population. So one of the questions is why? Why are so many folks on social grants? Now, the expanded definition of unemployment stands at about 35%, or 1 in 3 South Africans who are working age do not have access to work. Youth unemployment is 50%. Unemployment in the townships is 60%. And 60% of young people have never worked. So I think that those numbers speak for themselves. That when we look at the life trajectories of Bongani and Sipiwe, we have to ask which of these life trajectories is more representative of the situation faced by young men in South Africa today, and the situation that they face throughout their lives. Stunting is an issue, and it's reduced growth produced by sustained undernutrition during childhood, particularly up to about 24 months. And, you know, more than half of South Africans face food insecurity. More than a quarter of children in poor households experience stunting. So AIDS treatment is available. But one of the questions that we're beginning to have to ask is, what about other factors that drive inequality in health outcomes? And one of these is access to food, undernutrition. And these, unemployment, undernutrition, etc., these are the factors that compromise immune systems before people are exposed to HIV, before they're exposed to TB. And these are the factors this is the social context that's driving the epidemic. And these material deprivations, they lead to survival strategies. And often these involve resources and relationships. So when we see that the population that's kind of becoming HIV positive most quickly is women aged 15 to 24 in South Africa, I think you need to look at these numbers and imagine how folks are securing the means to survival, securing access to food for their children, all right? And a lot of this is through relationships. And there's folks that refer to this as provider love, all right? As a way of provision of goods and resources as a way of showing love. So I've shown you what's going on in South Africa. I've shown you the challenges that exist for people on a day-to-day level as they try and navigate their status to try to protect their health. The challenges are considerable. Historically, the global health movement has played a very important role in solidarity with the South African people in providing resources for access to AIDS treatment and other mechanisms. However, following the 2008 financial crisis, the World Bank has redesignated certain income levels for countries. And they've broken up middle income country status to higher middle income and lower middle income. And in fact, South Africa is designated as an upper middle income country. As a result, South Africa must begin planning for a 10-year transition period off of global fund funding, starting with this year. Now, one important little factoid. South Africa is characterized as a country with a low to moderate disease burden. Hold that thought. There are approximately 7 million people living in South Africa with HIV/AIDS. Low to moderate disease burden. There's drug-resistant strains of TB that are being passed person to person in various parts of South Africa. Some of these are extensively drug-resistant or XDR. And there's also TDR, totally drug-resistant TB, being kind of passed person to person in South Africa. So despite the fact that we see global fund funding actually ending the end of its cycle, I don't believe that we can sit here and accept the fact that South Africa is a country with a moderate disease burden. Now, to be fair, the Global Fund has given almost $750 million since 2003 to support the HIV/AIDS and TB response. There are currently 350,000 people on ART from the Global Fund. The question is, what starts to happen when the Global Fund funding kind of reaches its end? and we are looking at the end of that window. It's starting now, okay? Unfortunately, there's similar noises emanating from DC about the Presidential Emergency Plan for Age Relief, PEPFAR. I hope that's not true, but I think that we need to actually see that there's other organizations that this is happening with and fully appreciate and grasp that. So, of course, the global health organizations aren't the only entities that are trying to do something about AIDS and public health. The government, the African National Congress is as well. Unfortunately, and I'm happy to answer some more of these questions in the Q&A, there's a rising culture of self-enrichment within the ruling party. There was the creation of a black elite with black economic empowerment in the late 1990s. There's also, given the job situation in South Africa, there's a tendency for the ruling party to deploy its own party members within the state as employment opportunities, and for members of the party to apply for contracts for government tenders, and these folks are called tenderpreneurs. So there's a kind of an increasing tendency that we're seeing of party affiliation to be associated with upward economic mobility. You saw a different example with Bongani working in the kind of global health field, and this being a mechanism for upward mobility. Again, that avenue may be kind of closing shortly. But I think that what we need to understand about the ANC is that we should look at this along the lines of South African history. Generally speaking, the elite in South Africa have utilized their position to accumulate resources, to maintain power and support their constituents. And this is what the political elites have done in the post-apartheid era. The social grants program has redirected resources considerably to the Black South African population. The question that we have to ask ourselves is whether this is sufficient to change the trajectory of South African society, to change the social conditions that are driving HIV, that are driving TB. And I think that these are some of the questions that we need to start asking ourselves. So the ANC is starting to lose the support of black urban communities. And I think I want to point out one important factor as to why that might be the case. I mentioned a number of populations that are supported by social grants. I did not mention young men. After the age of 18, the child grant no longer applies, and young men are being essentially kind of moving out into the world where employment opportunities are quite scarce. Women can access some of the social benefits that are being kind of offered by the state through children, through social reproduction. It does not enable that to occur in total. It's not sufficient in terms of the resources that are able to be accumulated that way. But by accessing different relationships, the resources can be cobbled together to enable social reproduction. So I'm sorry this is a challenging picture that I'm sharing with you, but this is my data. And these are the questions that I'm having to grapple with as I work with folks for whom these are not abstract questions of theory or academic concerns. This is their daily life. And I'm increasingly beginning to work with community members on some of the informal mechanisms that they create for community support. Informal creches or preschool or daycares are an area that I've begun to conduct research on that are essentially done on a voluntary basis, as many women have to work to support their families and their children. There's the question of who watches after the children. And I think that we need to appreciate that people are always going to try and do their best to try and survive in the social conditions with which they're confronted, just as occurred under colonialism, apartheid, in the present day. But the questions that I'm beginning to have to think about are, but what happens when AIDS funding declines? What happens to the people who are on AIDS treatment because of the Global Fund and PEPFAR? Are they no longer on treatment? Can the government still afford treatment? Do we get a drug-resistant AIDS epidemic in South Africa? These are important questions. What happens if the state can no longer support the social grants program? The South African state has been running a budget deficit for some time now. Not all of it is driven by social grants. Some of it's driven by government expenditure on state-owned enterprises like South African Airways, Eskom, and others. What happens if they have to apply for funding from the International Monetary Fund or World Bank? Will they enable the South African government to still have this large-scale social grants program? Will they require them to cut it back to pay back their debts? These are important questions. One of the questions that I'm increasingly have to think about is who will stand with Sipiwe? When do folks stop fighting within these conditions? right? When do folks give up? How can they be supported? Who will stand with them? So thank you for your time.
Have the members of the dissident clique, as you call them, ever apologized or acknowledged bad judgment?
Well, this was a complex thing for me to write about because for a very long time, the obfuscating statements about the link between HIV and AIDS could not be attributed directly to the members of the ruling party who had led it. I think that there had been a number of documents that had been circulated amongst the ANC elite that had directly said HIV does not cause AIDS. But members of the ruling party have been very careful to say, we're not sure. It's a debate. We're questioning it. Similar approach to climate change, yeah, exactly, was employed to that end. However, in fact, quite recently, the former president of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki, came forward and claimed authorship of that document. So we actually now know with a high degree of certainty that the president was the author of documents that said HIV does not cause AIDS. Rather than apologizing, there's been a degree to which the president has doubled down on that position. And I think one of the concerns is that during the course of my field work in communities affected by the epidemic, I would run into folks who'd said, well, various non-governmental organizations had come to us and tried to advocate for alternative therapy. Many of these folks had been supported by members of the government to go out and try and go to townships, get people to stop taking AIDS treatment, to start alternative therapy, which was basically vitamins. And of course, the vast majority of these people passed away. So one of the questions that we don't have excellent data on, because people are very hesitant to disclose this, is the degree to which people still may harbor doubts about the link between HIV and AIDS. Even some of the activist groups that I worked with, some of the folks who went about educating people, even within their ranks, folks who'd been kind of educated in the science of HIV and AIDS, still harbored doubts, had lingering doubts. So I think that would indicate that there may be a much longer tail in terms of historical continuity with some of these questionable statements that were made by members of the ruling party. So unfortunately, there have been no apologies.
Okay, we've got a couple of questions actually that would like you to talk about South Africa in comparison to other countries or in the context of other countries. So how does the view of HIV/AIDS in Zimbabwe affect South Africa's response? Can you compare South Africa and Ethiopia? What is the impact of China in Africa, I guess, in regard to these issues?
Well, I think that one of the ways that we generally try and understand the epidemic is plural. It's plurality. It's epidemics. There are multiple epidemics on the continent. The epidemic in Southern Africa follows particular trends. I think historically the epidemic really initiated in the African context in Central Africa. And it's moved to West Africa in the 1980s and 1990s. And it moved into Southern Africa in the mid to late 1990s. So what I would emphasize is that each society has its own histories and its own ways of allocating resources, including land, access to kind of health services. And across Southern Africa, there are some general commonalities. So the kind of HIV prevalence in Botswana is actually quite similar to South Africa. And there's a very kind of simple way in which we can kind of correlate the two is that, Botswana was governed from Pretoria in South Africa until 1961. So historically, many of the same social systems were put into place there. I think Zimbabwe at the moment is in a very, very tricky place. I think it's very difficult to offer a comparative kind of lens for the issues that are going on there with South Africa. We are unsure as to how good the data is coming out of Zimbabwe at the moment, I would say. There's been a large or an ongoing question about the capacity of the Zimbabwean state over the past kind of 5 to 10 years Much of this has to do with the kind of ruling ZANU-PF and their decisions to allow for land invasions, and in some ways to kind of go their own way, and to a large degree ignore the input of the international community on issues of policy and economy. So when we think about Zim, I would say that right now the questions are not about HIV. Right now the questions are about food and about people having enough food. I know that I outlined that question for South Africa, that there is kind of food insecurity. Those questions are much more serious in Zimbabwe at the moment. Basic needs, I think, are trumping really the kind of the focus of public, health experts who've worked there historically. And I truly do hope that the kind of ongoing crisis finds a point of resolution. So I think that when we look at these kind of various factors, China's had a very big influence on Zimbabwe. In fact, the Zimbabweans kind of moved to Chinese financing as they kind of stopped paying back their loans to the World Bank and other bilateral lenders. And China has now stopped lending Zimbabwe money as well. And I think, generally speaking, the Chinese influence has been one around the extraction of natural resources. And in places like Angola, Chinese influence has been quite extensive. And it's been particularly around the extraction of petroleum products and oil. Historically, China, of course, had a very large influence on Mozambique, in large part funded some of their revolutionary forces. The same could be said for Zimbabwe. So when we look at Chinese influence, I think there's been a large emphasis on its contemporary expansion. But I would instead look to historical corollaries in the countries where they have had the largest influence. It's either natural resources or a kind of a continuation of historical kind of ties that kind of came about as the anti-colonial movement. I think that China's influence is set to continue to grow, and we will see where it heads from here.
I've got a kind of a series of nice questions that relate in broad sense to the idea of how social and structural factors influence people's choices. So I'll ask each one in turn. You spoke about pressures that have made relationships a crucial resource for survival in South Africa, and does that in some way affect the spread of AIDS there?
So there are lots of debates about these issues, so I'm going to be collapsing some of the complexity of these questions in my attempt to answer these succinctly. One of the ongoing questions about HIV transmission is the structure of sexual networks. And we all talk about social networks, but in fact, HIV is usually spread through sexual contact. So how are sexual networks structured in Uganda, in South Africa? Who are the kind of the nodes, the contacts? How do these overlapping systems work? And one of the questions that has come up alongside that is the question of multiple and concurrent partnerships, or folks having more than one sexual partner. There's been multiple ways to frame this, but I think some of the best work around this has been done by an anthropologist named Mark Hunter, who's tried to frame relationships as always involving resources to some degree. I think that, in our own parlance, we refer to this as young men who are marriage material, right? The idea that they have a stable income, that they have a job, that they have a future, or they could support a family. And of course, historically in Southern Africa, ilabola, or the paying of cows, was a central part of exchange between the female and male lineages, whereby the kind of ancestors would recognize the children of that mother through the father's patrilineage after ilabola had been paid. So resources have always played an important role in relationships and creating ties between different lineages and different families. And I think what Hunter tries to say is that we look through relationships through the lens of romantic love. We try to dispel notions of transactional or kind of resource-based elements in relationships, when in fact they're actually quite important and apparent in our own society. So the point that he tries to make is not to completely relativize this, but instead to understand that resources become more pressing in the context of material deprivation. One of the questions I ask my students sometimes is, what do you think your parents would do to make sure that you didn't starve? Where's the line to make sure your children don't starve? And it's not like starvation, is a slow process and then it's an immediate process, right? a slow question, then it's desperate. So the question of how folks turn to sex work or how folks turn to having an extra partner is a very important one. And I would just point out that, one of the big challenges that we have is that our historical precedent of restricting, U.S. donor funding to agencies or institutes that do not provide treatment services to sex workers is incredibly damaging. There's been research done on the highway between Durban and Johannesburg that found that 80% of sex workers had HIV. I think that when you look at the material situation that's faced by many poor and working class South Africans, I think the question of why folks turn to this kind of labor is not one of kind of free choice. It's one where they're circumscribed by very difficult circumstances. So yes, this figures quite heavily in the transmission of HIV. But I would just say that depending on the closeness of a partner, condom use may be negotiated. Depending on whether it's an occasional partner, condom use may be negotiated. The question is, what of the resources? Because resources are tied to the degree of intimacy and closeness. So when we go back to that number, women in the ages of 15 to 24, there's the DREAMS project that's being pushed by USAID and PEPFAR, so some really great people that are involved in that. But I think what we have to begin to ask ourselves are, what's going to be the situation that young men and women are faced with on a day-to-day level moving forward with the tapering of global fund funding, with the potential end of PEPFAR. It's a very challenging picture, and I'm sorry to be so direct about it. But these are the questions that people are bringing to me, and I would not be doing my job if I did not bring them to you.
The next question is closely related to what you've just been discussing, and I don't know if you feel like you've answered it fully. So let me just see if you want to add anything. The question is, what social advantages are conferred by sexual behaviors that spread AIDS?
Well, I think that probably this is just going to rehash some of the things that I already said, but I don't think that sexual behaviors are entered into, and risk is being assessed always in kind of unitary terms. In other words, someone does not go into a sexual encounter with the idea of, will this or will this not transmit HIV to my body? That's not their only consideration. So in terms of, I think framing it as advantage kind of leads to certain sorts of responses. What I would kind of perhaps offer up as a different framing would be, what is the kind of range of considerations that folks have to take into account when they're making these sorts of choices? And I think social reproduction is an incredibly important one in this context. The child grant is less than 400 Rand, is 14 Rand to $1. That's on a month. So many children are being reared in rural areas by their grandparents, where there's often subsistence plots. It's a bit cheaper to live there. There's also a granny grant or an old age grant, so you can combine these grants and just about survive and just about kind of rear the child. But the schools are very poor. Education is very poor in that area. There's many folks that I know that see their children twice a month, but they're trying to do their best for their families. And I think that is the dominant theme that I see. And again, I think that's one that probably many of us in this room can relate to, that many of our actions are not necessarily only driven by a concern for ourselves, but a concern for others. There's this idea in South African culture of Ubuntu, or the idea that I'm only fully human by recognizing your full humanity, and that we only reach our full potential as human beings by recognizing the humanness in one another and treating each other in this way. So I think when we frame this question in a different way, I think it allows us to see the social relationships that drive the epidemic, which aren't deviancy, which I think is our tendency when it comes to sexually transmitted infections. Folks must be deviant. In fact, I think what's a bit kind of challenging about the South African AIDS epidemic is that it's being driven by behavior that I think that we can all actually very deeply relate to on some level, whether that's family members or members of our lineage.
One final question, a very kind of specific one. Can you mention the movement of the South African primary care concept via Jack Geiger to the U.S. and primary care clinics supported by public funds here in the United States?
Well, the community-oriented primary care concept actually has had a social life that's expanded beyond South Africa. And I think that it's actually played an important role in other contemporary global health organizations that you may be much more familiar with. I believe that Partners in Health, Paul Farmer, Jim Kim, and others have really kind of played or put an emphasis on community health workers, right? Accompagnateurs, these people who accompany folks to clinics, who walk with them, who work with them, are from the community. I think a lot of what we see in community-oriented primary health are the roots of that idea. It's also important to note that Sidney Koch left South Africa after he was in Durban, and Mampele Rempele, who's Steve Biko's partner, was one of his students. One of the first things the Black Consciousness Movement did was establish a series of rural clinics that were based on community-oriented primary care in the Eastern Cape. And a big part of their agenda was primary health. But Sidney Koch actually moved to Israel. And there's several kind of community-oriented primary care institutions in Israel today, too. The question was referring to the work of Jack Geiger in the U.S., who took forward this concept and developed a series of community health clinics as part of the Great Society kind of program in the late 1960s. Some of these clinics and health centers continue to exist in places like West Virginia, places like New York, and elsewhere. And what I think is important is that, to a certain degree, the idea of educating the community about health, about illness, about epidemiological concepts and modes of transmission does also find resonance in our own society. And it was primarily focused in kind of urban populations, primary African American populations. And I think one of the things that is really interesting about that is that it's kind of an early mechanism of the traveling concepts of global health. That ideas about how to kind of address the health of historically disadvantaged populations in South Africa had application here in the U.S., which is, I think, an interesting thing for us to think about. And I think that even today, it's a concept that's being brought back in South Africa. There's certainly a number of projects that are employing community health workers that are trying to develop these concepts and practices much further. So these practices live on, and they certainly continue to inform the work that's being done all over the world.
Well, we've reached a time when we must conclude. Let me thank again the sponsors of today's talk, the University of Iowa's international programs, the Honors Program, the Stanley U of I Foundation Support Organization, as well as today's special financial sponsors, John Menninger, Paul Weller, Sarah Rines. We're very grateful. And also we thank City Channel 4 for making the videos of our programs available. Ted, as a small token of our appreciation, it's my pleasure to be able to present to you the highly coveted Iowa City Foreign Relations Council mug, which I have right here, which I had full faith in the interns that they had ready for me, and they did. So Ted, here you go. Thanks to all of you for participating. We are adjourned.